started, guys. Yeah. All right, you ready, Garrett? Okay.
Good to see you again.
All right, welcome back. Welcome back from lunch, everyone. I'm James Cooper with the Bureau of Consumer Protection at the Federal Trade Commission, and I'll be moderating this panel that's going to look at the competition and consumer protection issues surrounding online advertising. And to kick this panel off, we are going to have a presentation from Garrett Johnson. Garrett on the economics of online advertising, which is the area he's quite expert in. Garrett is an assistant professor at Boston University Questrom School of Business. And so without any further ado, I will turn it over to Garrett for our introductory talk.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be able to speak to you today. My job is to set the table, so to get us started, I just want to give you a sense of where digital advertising fits in the wider picture of advertising. As of last year, digital advertising overtook television to be the top advertising spending medium. And it had always been the case that search advertising was the largest part within digital advertising until a year ago when display advertising overtook search. Now, in modern advertising, 3/4 of this, the dollars spent, are in mobile rather than desktop. And a part of what's contributed to mobile being so successful is that video is very big on mobile and also in display. So just at a high level, some economic benefits of online advertising are that it subsidizes publisher content and the online services that we enjoy in our daily lives. This is not merely a theory. We have some work, or there's some work suggesting that ad blocking has actually reduced publishers' content and the quality of their content. Advertising certainly has a role to play in both informing consumers and in reducing their search costs. And on the advertiser side, it furthers their goals, whether that be increasing sales, increasing donations, or increasing the number of votes. Now, ad tech is a particularly dynamic and high-growth sector within the American economy, and American firms dominate in the ad tech sector worldwide. So, in my talk today, I want to talk about 3 distinguishing features of digital advertising. The first is the lower cost of targeting. And this is something that Avi Goldfarb has talked about in his review paper. Certainly, if you look at search advertising, you are advertising to consumers that are arriving at the search engine with some intent. And whether it be through paid or organic search, this medium is going to facilitate a match between consumers and firms. Now, display advertising has seen a massive increase in the ability of targeting as well, from simple contextual advertising to now following what consumers are doing in the past through their browsing history to target consumers behaviorally. The most famous or infamous example of this is retargeting. And increasingly, we see the use of offline data in the online world through firms engaging in database matches. One distinguishing feature of mobile advertising is there's an additional form of targeting, which is location targeting, which can be extremely fine-grained. So what does the economics theory literature have to say about this increase in the ability to target? Well, several papers make the point that this should soften competition because it's easier for advertisers to find the consumers that are loyal to them in the marketplace. From the perspective of publishers, we may think that this could either increase or decrease revenue, and the basic trade-off is that increasing targeting increases the valuation advertisers would have for the ads, but could thin marketplaces. Though empirically, we've seen that this generally creates revenue on net. One other phenomenon in this industry is the increased use of ad blocking. And we have some theory papers talking about the externality that causes for the rest of us that are still not blocking ads and how this can create some inefficiencies in the market. Finally, some theory papers have examined the trade-offs between offline and online advertising. And the basic difference there is it's much easier to target consumers online. Now, the second distinguishing feature of modern digital advertising is an increase in the ability to measure the effects of advertising. Now, some of this starts by just having simple data that connects the ads that people are seeing to the actions that they take at the consumer level, something that's certainly not possible with billboards or, in most cases, television. With this has come new ways of measuring the effects of advertising, such as clicks and conversions that can be specific to individual ads. And that has allowed the industry to optimize campaigns mid-flight using this feedback that they get from these outcomes, albeit with the trade-off that these are maximizing a proxy metric rather than ROI, so that you can create some inefficiencies. Now, as a result of advertising going digital, it's much easier to run large-scale experiments to measure the effects of advertising. Now, there's a burgeoning academic literature on this, but for the purposes of today, I want to talk about 3 important lessons that we've learned from this literature. The first is that it's really important to run an experiment to measure the effects of advertising, because when you don't, you typically come out with the wrong answer. The second thing we've learned is that it's now possible to do scalable experimentation for low or no cost, and that has caused a large influx of advertisers that are now using this technique to measure their return on investment. And the third thing we've learned is that it's extremely hard to get precise measurement on the effect of an ad campaign, in that it requires something like millions of user observations to be able to learn something. So the net effect of this is that because it's going to be very hard to measure the effects of advertising, that's going to create some accountability challenges that will hinder the effectiveness of the functioning of these ad markets. Now, the third distinguishing feature of modern display or digital advertising is the wide use of auctions. Now, auctions are very helpful because they facilitate the process of price discovery. There's no one at Google whose job it is to find out, what is the price of Civil War reenactment costumes, and how does that price vary around the anniversary of the Gettysburg battle. This is something that is done by the marketplace that can be done at very large scale. So economists have looked at many features of these auctions and how to run them optimally. One feature that distinguishes this form of auctions is that we don't just include the bids of users in search advertising, we also weight those bids by the quality of the advertising in order to have a good match between what advertisers are offering and what consumers are looking for in the marketplace. So this is one way that these platforms balance their interests with those of their consumers and those of their advertisers. Now, the final consequence of this is that by automating advertising sales and moving away from the sort of madmen, sharing a bottle of scotch back and forth way of selling ads to computers selling ads back and forth is, first of all, there's less scotch being sold, but it certainly reduces the transaction costs in this marketplace, allowing for improved targeting. So I wanted to talk at a high level about how the display advertising marketplace works. Obviously, on the advertiser side we've got the demand side of the marketplace, and on the supply side we have publishers like the New York Times that are trying to sell advertising. But there's a third agent here, which is consumers like you and I that are creating the opportunity for ads to be shown. Now, ad impression is a single ad on a single web page by a single consumer for a single load of that page. So it's a very fine-grained level of analysis that's very different from television, where you're buying, Modern Family on a Saturday night for all of the United States. This is also going to mean that the supply of these impressions is random and not something that publishers are going to exactly know. So these two are going to meet in a marketplace. And for most publishers, that marketplace takes one of two forms. The first is guaranteed contracts. Guaranteed contracts are bulk buys of advertising, specifying the price and quantity and targeting attributes and time of the campaign. And ad exchanges are platforms running real-time auctions. It's kind of a miracle of technology that happens in less than 0.1 seconds and allows advertisers to find these individual users and individual impressions that they're interested in. Now, this is important to recognize because in the search ad space, 100% of ad sales are programmatic. And in the display ads side, 82.5% of these transactions are done programmatically. Now, most of this happens in mobile, but one sort of thing on the horizon here is that currently less than 10% of TV advertising is transacted programmatically, and that's something we see expanding in the future quite a bit, which is probably why we see firms like AT&T buying AppNexus. All right, so in today's session, we're going to be talking about market power and about privacy issues. So I wanted to give a high-level introduction to both. The challenge with market power in this setting is first in defining the market. So when we think of concentration on the online advertising side, we need to remember that there's also substitutability with the offline advertising as well. And Avi and Catherine have a nice paper showing that empirically. The other challenge is that has been brought up, I think, in the previous hearings as well, is the challenge of understanding multi-sided platforms. So in particular, this is not a case where a monopolist is making the price very high. In fact, this is usually the case that platforms are providing free content and services, whether it be search or email or maps, that provide a lot of benefit to us in our daily lives at no cost. Now, there is actually some work showing some countervailing power on the demand side, and the way this arises is that advertisers are typically working with intermediaries like ad agencies to purchase advertising, which creates some countervailing power on their side. Now, another challenge in this industry is the prevalence of lack of transparency and the prevalence of fraud, which has been the subject of a major report by the National Advertising Association, as well as, I gather, a FBI investigation currently. But when we talk about market power, one kind of important thing to have in the back of our minds is just the market concentration of the top two firms. So Google and Facebook collectively make up 57% of online ad spending. Google's dominance, of course, arises from its dominance in the search space, whereas Facebook's dominance arises from its dominance in the display ad space. 2 of every $5 spent in the display ad space is spent with Facebook. And this is a consequence of basically having the audience, as well as the targeting and measurement capabilities that draw advertisers to spend money there. Now, pretty recently, there's been 2 big companies, Amazon and AT&T, through their acquisition of AppNexus, that are entering this marketplace, and we could anticipate some changes there. But in the shadow of these 2 great big companies, there's a very vibrant industry. Here's a illustration from a company called Luma that shows you all the different companies that are involved in this space, and you get a sense of how rich this is. In the top center, you see ad exchanges, which we've talked about before, but I haven't mentioned the plethora of intermediaries that advertisers and publishers use to provide services that allow them to buy and sell advertising in this marketplace. So there's a vibrant marketplace with a lot of acquisitions that's going on in the background. Turning now our attention to the other topic of this hearing, which is consumer protection issues, I'm going to focus on the issue of privacy, but certainly we have literature that deals with other issues like ad disclosure in native advertising, as well as equity in ad targeting that Anya could speak to very knowledgeably. So I've been very interested for a long time in the privacy consequences of the online display advertising marketplace. Here, what I've done is I've visited a newspaper in Pennsylvania called The Morning Call, and I'm using an extension to my browser called Disconnect, which allows me to visualize all the third parties that are notified of me visiting there. And you can see that dozens of advertisers and intermediaries have been notified of my visit without my explicit consent, and this is something that's pretty widespread across the web. So what's the regulatory environment for this like in the United States? Well, currently there's no regulation except for honest business practices. U.S. regulators have favored for the past decade an opt-out policy whereby consumers that are concerned by tracking and that are concerned by online behavioral advertising can opt out and avoid these practices. And around 2010, the industry banded together with a self-regulatory program to provide an opt-out for consumers. So this regulatory program is called the Ad Choices Program, and the way it works is that it has a notification function where there's small icons basically on all display ads that consumers can click on to arrive at a consumer choice page. And on the consumer choice page, consumers can click to opt out of online behavioral advertising and tracking. Now, this page functions a lot like the FTC's Do Not Call list, with the caveat that the Do Not Call list refers to phone numbers which are stable over time, whereas our computers don't have identifiers for these devices that are stable over time, which creates some challenges in the persistence of this choice mechanism. So I was very interested in studying this because this issue hadn't been studied, or at least the self-regulatory approach hadn't been studied by economists and marketing people. And to set the stage, kind of what is the number of people we should expect are opting out? Well, if you survey people, reliably 2/3 of people say that they dislike online behavioral advertising. So we might expect that a lot of consumers are taking action here. But when we looked at the data, what we found is that only, in fact, 0.23% of US impressions arose from consumers that had opted out of tracking. So what we observe is a privacy paradox where there's a huge gulf between people's stated preferences and the actions that they take. Now, this is not unique to our setting. Certainly a lot of other privacy research has found sort of similar gaps, like a gap between the willingness to pay and the willingness to accept when it comes to privacy. But still, this gulf is particularly wide in this setting, and we can talk more about that in the panel. The challenge, though, is that this form of advertising provides a tremendous amount of value. So basically, the consensus in the literature is that the value of a cookie to this marketplace is either a lot or even more than a lot. Estimates range from 50% to 65% in terms of the reduced value that you have when you remove online behavioral advertising. And so this creates a very difficult challenge for policymakers in examining this issue. Lastly, I wanted to speak very briefly to some issues with privacy policy because they can overlap with competition policy. Now, one way that this can be anti-competitive is that it's when you impose costs on firms, like the cost of getting consumer consent, it can be easier for large firms to get this consent than small firms, which can create an anti-competitive effect. Also, large firms have lots of resources to throw at the problem, and so they may be able to succeed more so than small firms in the marketplace. Now, on the other side, there may be some pro-competitive effects of privacy policy. The first is that large companies endure a lot more consumer and regulator scrutiny when it comes to their privacy practices. So there's no regulators in Europe that are currently targeting the number 551st website in Lithuania, but it's really only a matter of when that they go after Facebook or Google. So this is not to my this has not been, to my knowledge, emphasized in the literature, but this creates a bit of a safety in the herd effect, where as long as you're not sticking out as too large of a firm or sticking out as a firm that's engaging in particularly egregious privacy practices, the chances that you're going to be singled out with regulatory actions is smaller. So the task of summarizing 20 years of literature is a very challenging one. So for those of you that are interested in further reading, I would recommend these 3 review articles by Catherine Tucker and Avi Goldfarb, who's in the audience today. This is such a dynamic industry that I actually probably spend about 20 minutes every day just keeping up with the trade press and all the goings-on in the industry. So those of you that are interested in doing that, I would encourage you to check out the AdExchanger newsletter. So with the table set, I will now turn things over to the panel.
Thank you, Garrett. That was that was great, and it is a perfect stage setter for the panel. Like the other panels, people will be walking around taking with cards from the audience if you want to answer or want to ask questions. And before I get started, on the off chance that I say anything remotely substantive, anything I say today are my opinions only and don't represent the Federal Trade Commission or any individual commissioner. So we get each one of the panelists will have about 5 minutes to talk before we get into discussion. Let me just briefly introduce them. Their full bios are in the in the book, but just in the interest of time, I'll be quick with this. So Anja Lambrecht, right next to me, she's an associate professor of marketing at the London Business School. Next to her is Lee Frund. She's the president and CEO of the Network Advertising Initiative. Next to Lee is Ali. Ali Baum is a policy counsel at Public Knowledge, where she focuses on government affairs, including broadband and privacy policy. Next to Allie is Howard. Howard Beals is a professor of strategic management and public policy at George Washington University, and he's also a former director of the Bureau of Consumer Protection at the FTC. And finally, Katie McGinnis is a policy counsel at Consumers Union in their Washington, D.C. office. So to start off with our presentations here for the panel, let me turn it over to Anya.
Thank you. Do you have a clicker?
It's here. Do you want to
Or
come
do
up
I-
here?
I can come up here?
Sure, sure.
This one here?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Well, thank you so much, James, for the introduction. Thank you, Garrett, for the first introduction into online advertising. What I will do very briefly, build on what Garrett said, and go in a little bit more depth on what is one important trade-off when we speak about competition and consumer protection online advertising. So this is what advertising used to be. Right? Advertising used to be an information message targeted, untargeted almost, to a mass of consumers out there, which could be on a billboard and outdoor advertising. It could be in TV advertising, or it could be in magazines, perhaps. In each of those cases, the advertiser speaks to a mass of largely anonymous consumers. Well, what advertising is today, when we speak about data-driven online advertising, it is about an individual consumer who visits, for example, this fashion website, and after having visited that fashion website, based on all the tracking mechanism that Garrett briefly mentioned, is shown an ad that precisely displays the product the consumer looked at before in potentially other related products. Now, this form of advertising is typically referred to as retargeting. Now, why do firms use this type of advertising to reach out to highly specific consumers? Well, the underlying idea is that rather than targeting a large mass where some people might or might not be interested in the specific product being offered, we focus on those who are most likely to be on the market. And the key measurement criteria here that the industry uses is what is typically referred to as the lift, which is the change in the probability of purchasing but if a consumer does not see an ad relative to a consumer actually seeing the ad, right? And so you can probably imagine that if you focus on consumers who are more likely to buy, the average lift is going to be larger. So I studied this type of advertising, retargeted advertising, and the part of the question being, well, if an advertiser actually implements that, what type of messages should they be sending to the consumer? And it turns out that rather than showing the specific products in many circumstances while targeting the specific consumer, the advertiser might benefit from showing a more generic ad. Now, what does this mean? Without going into detail here, it actually means it's incredibly hard for advertisers to find the best ways, even in a data-driven environment, to evaluate their data and target consumers. Right? So while there is a value to targeting, it is not always easy to implement. Now, the second point I would like to make is getting on the other side of the trade-off. So here first we looked at the view of the advertiser and the benefits of targeting to an advertiser. Well, the other side is that advertising today, data-driven online advertising, supports a large number of free content and services. You might think about online content providers, which range from ESPN to CNN to New York Times or LA Times, that essentially are able to provide informational services to consumers for a little price or no price at all. And these revenues come from advertising, as you are well aware of. Now, the question is, what is the situation for these type of firms when we take away or reduce targeting? As I said before, what targeting means, it allows advertisers to have a higher probability, a higher lift, a higher increase in the probability of converting a consumer. And when we have, in a world of less or less granular targeting, this may potentially go down, meaning that any individual advertising impression creates less value for an advertiser, and by consequence, this may potentially depress advertising prices. And you can see where this is leading to a potentially reduced revenue opportunity for these type of platforms. In one of these papers, we studied a specific setting of ESPN and find that they benefit particularly from online advertising in periods of high demand, when it's actually more beneficial to give content away for free because of the particular structure of the consumers coming into the market. And you can see that, especially in periods of high demand to depress prices, this may have potentially significant effects for the platforms. Now, let me summarize what are the key policy issues that we're facing when we're considering a particular trade-off. It is that, on the one hand, data-driven online advertising can make ads more relevant to consumers. It can allow firms to enter the market or to continue existing in a market by offering free services or content. And on the other hand, we obviously have data-driven advertising that may raise privacy concerns in terms of tracking, storage, and sharing of data, which is potentially opaque for consumers and not controlled. However, I think what we see with GDPR in Europe now is that control can be potentially very, very effortful. And so to wrap this up, I think the key question is here how to get the balance right. This can be very hard, especially since consumers and many consumers benefit substantially from getting access to services or content in a free or freemium economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Lee, you're up next.
Hey, can everybody hear me? Good. By the way, I just wanted to make one comment before I started, that online advertising firms do drink scotch. So maybe scotch isn't, the market is not completely dead. So thank you so much, James, and to the FTC for including me. For those who don't know me or the organization I represent, my name is Lee Freund, and I head the NAI, or the Network Advertising Institute. It is a nonprofit self-regulatory organization that was set up in 2000. So even though the entire industry began its self-regulatory efforts in 2010, the NAI is composed of basically the third parties, or those folks in the middle of that Lumascape that you just saw, the pipes that connect the consumers to the advertisers and the publishers. So we bound together in 1999, 2000. At this stage in time, we have over 100 member companies, each of which are required to adhere to the privacy protections that are set out in the NAI Code of Conduct. So our members include, as I said, all of those folks that make up the middle of that Lumascape, ad networks, exchanges, platforms, other technology providers, and our member companies basically form the backbone of that industry that you've been hearing about, helping advertisers reach consumers that are most likely to be interested in their products and services, and allowing those consumers to receive the ads that are personalized to their interest. So the NAI Code and our guidance continually evolves to adapt to changes in technology and changes in consumer expectations. So for example, I think Garrett spoke a little bit about the programmatic TV space. Earlier this year, we issued guidance to address how our members may and may not collect and use information about video content that consumers see on television, and helping to ensure that those consumers receive notice and choice with respect to that medium of advertising. We're currently also undertaking a pretty major update to our code of conduct that will include some robust new privacy protections. And so, in essence, we're constantly adapting, as self-regulatory organizations do, to adapt to kind of rapid changes in technology and the requirement that our members provide consumers with choice regarding those technologies, and how they collect and use information about consumers is a vital component of what we do every day. We have published 3 updates to the code, 4 guidance documents since 2012, and so it is always our mission to keep up with and stay ahead of the technologies that our industry puts forth. So today, I'm going to leave most of the economics to the economists, but today a broad array of rich content is available on the internet. News content, information, video, and music streaming services, interactive software services, email, social networks. They've all experienced robust growth over the last several years, and they provide those services and information to consumers for free or little cost because they are supported by digital advertising. So in digital advertising, including personalized advertising, which is the way we refer to it at the NAI, has basically been the lifeblood for the internet. It's the reason I think that the US firms dominate globally in this space, providing benefits to consumers while also providing the opportunity for those businesses. So as the internet-based media ecosystem has become richer and far more diverse, one thing has remained constant, and that is by far the most popular model among consumers is free or low-cost ad-supported content. We've done pretty significant research. We've got data from Nielsen that suggests while the media landscape expands, the type of content consumers are spending time with, which is free content, has remained fairly consistent, and it remains the medium that consumers gravitate toward the majority of time when you look at their viewing habits online. So the share of time spent with ad-supported content on platforms such as TV, radio, smartphones, video games, and tablets for adults in 2017 was 86%. That seems to have remained flat over the last decade. And research also demonstrates that the considerable economic contribution provided by this industry. So our ad-supported internet has created a little over 10 million jobs by 2016, and the interactive marketing industry has contributed over $1 trillion to the U.S. economy, which has doubled in the last 4 years and accounts for 6% of gross domestic product. So when we put privacy and consumer protection we must remember the robust effects on our U.S. economy. So when thinking about data collection and use in connection with digital advertising, I think it's important to recognize, and I think there's a little bit of a misperception out there, data in this context has an extremely short shelf life. Companies are interested in data only to the extent that it's relevant to the personalized advertising they want to show, and data used, for example, to show me an ad when I'm interested in going to Cancun, which I often am, is not relevant once I've taken that vacation or purchased my plane tickets. So there's a definite point of diminishing return that disincentivizes companies to keep a massive vault of consumer data. Typical data used for personalized advertising by many of our companies is relevant for 30 days or less, unless I think you're buying a car, in which case it's a little longer. So I think it's important that self-regulation and any future legislation, I know that's probably a topic at these hearings, any future legislation or regulation encourages companies to embrace privacy protective practices that are tailored to the sensitivity of the data that those companies are processing, rather than kind of lumping all kinds of data together with broad definitions, which would remove incentives that we have, for example, in our code for data de-identification, pseudonymization, data minimization practices, et cetera. So I think full names, email addresses, phone numbers, can be collected, but our business goals can also be met by using pseudonymous identifiers. So under our code, pseudonymous identifiers allow companies to recognize an internet-connected device without directly identifying the user of that device. And they're particularly important for privacy protection because they allow companies to recognize a browser or device without collecting any additional information that reveals the identity of the individual. So I think when we talk about privacy, we think about the types of data that are collected, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. And our companies really strive to do, privacy protective practices and data minimization practices within their businesses. Thank you.
Allie?
Move the microphone a little closer.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. So in 2002, Target wanted to identify which of its customers might be pregnant. It recognized that the arrival of a new child often led to changes in consumers' buying habits. And if they could identify when people were expecting children, they could potentially win them over as customers for years to come. So they crunched the data in their pregnancy registry, their baby registries, that's what those things are called, and they identified 25 products that pregnant women were buying. And using that, they were able to create a pregnancy prediction score that they applied to customers who didn't have baby registries with Target. And they used that to figure out, what coupons to send them to lure them into the store as customers. Data-driven advertising has only mushroomed since 2002. Data-driven advertising has some distinct advantages. It allows for customized online experiences for users. It can reduce irrelevant ads, help consumers discover new relevant products, reduce search times and costs, make online shopping easier, and as Lee pointed out, it can help folks access content without having to pay money for it. It can also help businesses, particularly small and local businesses, reach very niche audiences. But that's not the full story. Data-driven advertising can facilitate higher prices and reduce competition. So algorithms can monitor prices and other terms of sale in near real time, allowing companies to adjust their practices based on a more detailed view of the market. Notably, and often that means that they don't have to cut prices to remain competitive. Notably, this practice is probably not redressable under existing antitrust law because there's no express agreement to fix prices. Moreover, pervasive data collection allows companies to develop detailed user profiles about their customers and their customers' willingness to pay, which allows them to enables personalized pricing strategies and precise manipulations of consumer choice. And I should step back, particularly following Lee, to say, often the information that is used here is not the sensitive data points. It's not your name. It's not your, social security number. It's not even your health status. Think back to my Target example. The information that was used was these women's buying histories. They were buying lotion. They were buying unscented lotion. They were buying zinc. They were buying magnesium. None of this is sensitive, right? But it revealed very sensitive information. It revealed their health status, their pregnancies. So when we talk about protecting privacy, we do need to talk about the panoply of data and not just sensitive information. Data-driven online advertising also forecloses opportunities for consumers. When we show relevant ads to folks, we're excluding them from seeing things that the algorithm has determined are not relevant to them, right? But that may mean that they're unaware of particular opportunities that they don't see. And so maybe that doesn't matter if you're advertising unscented lotion. But if you're advertising housing or job opportunities, that matters tremendously. And that's not conjecture. So employers have used algorithms to prevent women and older folks from seeing high-level management positions. Landlords have used algorithms to prevent minorities, racial minorities, from seeing certain housing postings. Data-driven advertising also incentivizes the collection of more data, which jeopardizes privacy. And the data demonstrate that although some consumers really like targeted advertising, many consumers find the most privacy-intrusive ads, quote-unquote, unnerving. So interestingly, and I'm going to sort of throw this out as a new idea, maybe, online advertising may actually be a space where more privacy-enhancing approaches may actually be more competition-enhancing as well. So long as we rely primarily on targeted advertising, we're going to entrench the duopoly of companies that have access to vast troves of data. But if we were to limit the ability to, and I realize Congress might have to do this might not be something the FTC can do, but if we were to limit the amount of data that can be used in advertising, we might see a return to contextual advertising, so trying to reach sports fans on ESPN or music fans on Rolling Stone. That's a practice that more companies can participate in. It's also more privacy protective because you don't actually have to know much about the consumer other than that she's gone to ESPN or to Rolling Stone or searched for music. And interestingly, that may have some benefits for companies. So we heard yesterday from one of the researchers who said that targeted advertising has raised revenues by 0.000, it's 4 zeros, 8%. But can be 500 times more expensive than contextual advertising. Now, I went to law school, so I'm not good at math, but or at least that's the joke. But that doesn't sound like a great return on investment to me. In addition, from a brand safety concern, question, if you're doing contextual advertising, your brand is you're likely to know the closed universe of what your brand is going to show up next to a lot better than you would in a targeted advertising environment. So in sum, data-driven online advertising has transformed the market. It poses opportunities. It also poses threats to privacy, to competition, and to consumers' well-being. But it doesn't have to be this way. So the FTC should encourage Congress to enact comprehensive privacy legislation, and we can talk in the Q&A about what my organization would like that to look like. But the FTC can also take some actions on its own. For example, it could use its UDAP authority to determine on a case-by-case basis whether it is deceptive for websites and services to place third-party trackers all over the internet and track consumers when they're on other websites without their knowledge or consent. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to testify, and I look forward to addressing your questions in the Q&A.
Thanks, Allie. Howard, you're up.
James, could you pass the clicker, please?
Here, I could throw it, but.
I got you.
The big green arrow, okay. There we go. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I want to make just a few points, some of which have been made already. But most of what we enjoy on the internet is from an economic perspective, a public good. Content isn't used up. And it's essentially free to add another viewer to most kinds of internet content. Now, there's some things that are different, like email services and things like that, but most of the content that we enjoy is a public good. Throughout the history of publishing, the way we've gotten public goods in all sorts of media markets has depended heavily on advertiser support. There are models that are pure subscription models, but they're very small markets. And very small parts of the market. Typically, media markets are heavily dependent on revenue that comes from advertising, and that's the way markets provide the public good. Advertising converts the public good of content into a private good of advertising exposures that can be sold to somebody, and that's how this market works. There's no reason to think financing of internet content is going to be any different from any of those other media markets or from the couple of hundred years of history we have of the economics of those markets that says advertiser support is likely to be a crucial element of providing that content. Second key point is information really adds value to online advertising. There's two studies that I did. One is a survey of major advertising networks at a time when advertising networks were the main way that third-party advertising was sold. We looked at behaviorally targeted advertising versus run-of-network advertising, and the price was just short of 3 times higher for the targeted advertising compared to the non-targeted run-of-network advertising that could be anywhere. We did a more recent study in 2013 of auction prices on 2 different ad exchanges. And what we found was if there was no cookie, there's one price for the advertising. If there's a new cookie that was just placed there, the price of the advertising roughly triples. Okay, and the longer the cookie's been there, the more the advertising sells for. The more information that you have, the more valuable the advertising is to publishers. Now, losing somewhere in the neighborhood of 2/3 of your revenue if you can't target based on information value is something that's likely got serious implications for the kinds of content that publishers can provide. The other thing that's important about this is the sales that happen through third parties are much more important to smaller websites. This is data from Atomic that tracks and it's a count of the ads. Where does each ad come from that is served on a particular web page? And I don't know that you can read it, but it's the website rank is the horizontal axis, and the percentage of the ad impressions that are sold that way is the vertical axis. Even the largest websites sell a majority of their advertising through networks or programmatic advertising. And for the smaller websites, number 4,000 there, and obviously websites get a lot smaller than that, some 2/3 of their advertising revenue is sold through, it comes through sales through third parties. Right? It's not sold direct. It's sold through either a network or an ad exchange as the way they make money to finance the content that they're providing. If you think about that Lumascape that you saw, which is a great graphic, most of those companies nobody ever heard of. I was looking for examples because I never heard of these companies. And so I looked at the list of NAI members, and here's the first 4 members. 33 across, Acuin, Acuity, Adara. How many of you have ever heard of any of them? Not very many. Certainly most consumers have not. But those kinds of intermediaries are an important source of competition in an online advertising market that's mostly Google and Facebook. If you can't use information that you obtain through cooperation with publishers and the placement of cookies to find out about how consumers are using the internet, then you can't sell that advertising in a way that is competitive. If consent requirements get more elaborate for these behind-the-scenes companies, if you have to agree to them, that's going to selectively disadvantage these companies compared to the Googles and Facebooks of the world that consumers have actually heard of. And that's something that's much more likely to entrench a duopoly than to undermine it, just because consent is difficult. Finally, it's important to remember advertising is actually a good thing. The FTC is actually, for a long time, has been a leader in recognizing the benefits of advertising for competitive markets. Advertising tends to lead to lower prices. It leads to product improvements. It narrows the differences between demographic groups. And it's FTC studies that have established a lot of those propositions. There's no reason to think online advertising is any different. It's a cheaper way to do what is a good thing for consumers and likely to enhance market performance across the board. Thanks, and I look forward to our discussions.
Thanks, Howard. Kate?
Thank you, James. Thank you for organizing this panel, and thank you for the FCC for hosting the hearings and for the opportunity to talk to you today. As James mentioned, my name is Katie McGinnis, and I serve as Policy Counsel for Consumers Union, which is the advocacy division of Consumer Reports. So my comments here today will be focused on the consumer's perspective of a lot of these practices. So consumers currently don't really understand the advertising ecosystem as it currently affects them. They have some sort that they're being tracked across the web and that their online and offline activities are being correlated in order to serve them with ads, but they're not really sure how to take control of their digital footprint or how to push back on companies who are tracking them across the web entirely. Although they have some tools at their disposal, such as ad blockers and the use of a virtual private network, these tools don't have a lot of market depth, in part because it's hard. It takes the consumer to do a couple of really positive steps in order to put these into action. But we're seeing that ad blockers this year will have about a 30% use across the web, which is fantastic. And then we've seen an increased use of virtual private network use among consumers, due in part to the reversal of the broadband privacy protections at the FCC by the Congress last year. So we see this disconnect between consumer knowledge of tracking and consumers, how much consumers are actually tracked. But there's also some competition issues at work here as well. As companies amass more and more knowledge about individuals and how they use the web, they're able to manipulate the kind of services that consumers are presented with and the kind of economic opportunities that they're presented with as well. So we've seen online retailers such as Amazon artificially preference some products over others on the virtual shelf on Amazon in order to favor the companies that they have business practices with. We've also seen that consumers are not being served with the same sort of ads as other consumers based on decisions that are based on their online activities. For instance, we've seen this effect, especially in the opportunity for housing and employment ads. And these opportunities are a huge, these ads that are serving opportunities are a huge disservice to many consumers, because if some people, especially women, are being shown ads for some ads, are being shown the same ads as men, they're not going to have the same access to opportunities for employment and advancement as other people. But we're going to deal with those comments next week more on the panels on algorithmic bias and algorithmic transparency. But we've also seen companies take advantage of their dominant place in the online advertising ecosystem in order to push out other competitors. For instance, we saw the use of Facebook buying Anavo, a really poor VPN. Please don't use this VPN, in order to kind of sniff out what their possible users and their users were doing on their phones and other applications. This led to Facebook realizing that Snapchat was going to be a huge competitor for them. And so they developed some practices some offerings on their platform that were similar to Snapchat in order to kind of regain the dominance and influence in this spectrum. In addition, consumers are also being shown prices that are based on their online activities or decisions that are being made about them based on their online activities. This is especially apparent in the travel ecosystem, where consumers are shown different flight prices than others based on their searching techniques, and also how often they've been looking at prices. In all these previously mentioned instances, two things come out. Consumers don't have knowledge or transparency about the kind of ways that their privacy is being invaded upon, and how companies are using their information. Unfortunately, the self-regulatory response to this has completely failed. We saw an abandonment of do not track years ago. The resources that are offered by industry now are not comprehensive. They're only followed by a few companies, and these markers are easy to override. And consumers deserve the right to protect their privacy and to push back on companies' tracking practices across the web. In light of this, we strongly support a federal data privacy law that would give consumers the right to control, access, and know what companies are doing with their information. One of the most important things that have been introduced recently that may serve to help give consumers these controls is Senator Wyden's discussion draft of the Consumer Data Protection Act, which allows for consumers to have controls in order to cover their digital footprint and make sure that their privacy preferences are acknowledged and followed by the companies that wish to track them across the web. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. All right. So let's dive in. There was a lot put on the table. One thing, and this was in we heard this in Garrett's opening talk, and it's out in people who've looked at the market. I think recognize this, is we don't see a lot of consumer uptake on privacy enhancing technologies. When it comes to online advertising, I think, and I forgot the exact, I think it was 0.23% was Garrett cited. At the same time, we see surveys that suggest that consumers are concerned about privacy, and I just like to kind of throw that out there and see, what explains this disconnect. And we haven't heard from Garrett in a while, so let me let Garrett start that off.
Well, thank you. I've thought a lot about this specific issue because there is this huge gulf between the people that take action and the people that say that they're very concerned about these practices. So I think part of the challenge is that when people are asked about their privacy preferences, it makes it very salient, but they have fairly ill-defined preferences over privacy. It's hard for people to think about. That's why you see basically people will sell their information and their mother down the road if you give them a slice of pizza. And it's very easy to move people's privacy preferences and actions with small costs and small incentives. So that's a challenge that we face. Certainly when it comes to online display advertising and the Ad Choices program, one issue is a lack of awareness. So awareness numbers range from 6 to 37% on the specific mechanism. But there too, awareness is a choice. This is something that people could find out about it if they wanted to. I think one underlying challenge here is the technological sophistication of the average consumer. That's one reason why we see Ad Choices have a higher adoption rate for non-default browsers like Chrome and Facebook. one usability study by Lori Craner and co-authors examined many different options available to consumers, and what they found is that all of them were failing usability tests, even the ones that were developed by private corporations for the specific purpose of helping consumers with their privacy. Just to give you some sense of the numbers when it comes to online privacy protection demand, we looked at the use of various privacy protecting extensions on Chrome, and we found that there is 68,000 users of the Ad Choices extension, but the two top extensions, which are Ghostery and Privacy Badger, only have 2.7 million and 0.5 million users worldwide, respectively. Not only do we see low adoption of these privacy-preserving technologies, we also see very low consumer search. So we went on Google Trends and we found that there's about the same amount of search volume for ad choices as there is for internet privacy topics, as there is for do not track. And to benchmark this, I went and looked at some pretty niche search terms like the candy Swedish fish, the Star Wars character Jar Jar Binks, the 2003 Tommy Wiseau film The Room, and those all had 2 to 5 times more search volume than these topics. Ghostery received 3 times more search volume than ad choices, but still at some point we have to confront the fact that this is not top of mind in terms of many observables for many consumers.
Thanks. Anyone else like to weigh in on this? Let me do Ali and then Howard, if that's okay, and then Anja.
Sure. So I think that, first of all, there's certainly a sentiment of resignation among consumers and sort of, I can't control it, I will be tracked. I don't like this, but what can I do? That is something that has to be pushed back against. I also think the question is, which privacy-enhancing technologies are not being used? So 92% of Facebook users change their privacy settings from the default. That to me says consumers, in fact, want to control what audiences are seeing their information. It's not that they don't care about privacy, but that may be a tool that folks have sort of figured out how to use. I think ad choices, in a way, is a really bad example because the ad industry actually did some marketing research with Future of Privacy Forum to figure out what phrases and what symbol were going to be most salient and helpful to consumers. And the results came back with something like there was a symbol called the asterisk man, and that was the one that the most people clicked on. And there was the phrase like, why did I get this ad? And people understood that. So instead of going with those things that performed really well with consumer understanding, the ad industry decided to go with the little, triangle with the tiny little eye and with ad choices, which was not something that pulled particularly well with consumers. So if the tool is designed to be, I don't want to say deceptive, but maybe a little bit deceptive, not exactly user-friendly to consumers, it's not exactly surprising to me that consumers haven't had a huge uptake in using it.
Howard, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind that this kind of a disconnect between surveys and behavior is really quite commonplace. I went searching for what people think about organic foods, and half of people have a preference for organic foods. Market share is about 5%. All right, behavior and preferences don't connect. Problem with preferences in surveys is they have no price, it's so at best what you're looking at is demand if the price is 0. And that's going to be different than demand in the real world where there is a price, where there is a cost of using privacy-enhancing technologies. But the cost is not particularly high, and what revealed preference says is consumers don't care enough about the tracking kinds of privacy concerns to be willing to do anything about it. And that says this is not, from consumers' perspective, an important problem for them. Even if they do change their Facebook settings, that's a whole different kind of privacy concern.
Thanks. Anja, do you want to jump in?
Yes, so Garrett made this point. It's just simply not top of mind for many consumers. And along with what Howard just said, I would agree that if you ask consumers a fairly generic question without offering a trade-off, you're likely to get a very different response than if you actually ask consumers to trade off, right, and to invest. So coming from Europe, the land of GDPR, while I haven't seen any broad data summarizing this, let me just offer some case-based evidence, so to speak. When you browse in Europe, you're asked on every individual website for permissions, right? And the way this is implemented varies across websites, but it's basically about the right for websites to collect your data and use it for different purposes, including how information is being displayed, but also for advertising. Well, it turns out if you do that 20 times a day, it gets pretty time-consuming and hassle-intense, and so I think I wouldn't be surprised if data were to show that many consumers are actually not willing to invest this time amount of effort. And so Ellie talked about consumer resignation. This is not very hard. You do a couple of clicks and change your settings. So I wouldn't say consumers have resigned here. If this is what data were to show, I would rather argue that the cost for a consumer is perceived as not outweighing the potential benefits.
Let me go Katie and then Lee.
So first of all, I wanted to respond to Howard's positioning here that this is similar to an organic food situation where people might preference having organic food, but they're not actually buying it. And in that instance, I think the problem is, I don't know really that much about the market, but I imagine that part of the problem is access and money. And just organic foods cost much more, it's harder to find, so it's not really a one-to-one comparison. And I think in this situation, consumers are trading an extreme amount of time in order to have their privacy preferences acknowledged. And it's not just a couple of clicks. Most of these opt-outs are really buried quite far down. They're really hard to navigate. They change month to month, day to day. Even my job day to day is to look at these privacy policies. I still have a hard time finding where I'm supposed to opt out, where I'm supposed to delete my data, and where I'm supposed to file some sort of redress. So I think the thing is, the main problem here is that we framed this whole situation incorrectly. The onus shouldn't be on the consumer at all. And that's one reason why Consumer Reports has introduced our digital standard in order to test products for privacy and security, is because consumers just can't evaluate these things on an even playing field, especially when they are required to read these long and extensive privacy policies, where really it's a choice of yes to the privacy policy or no, I can't use the service, which is not really a choice at all for many consumers. So the framing should be the onus should be on manufacturers to make it easier for consumers to have their ad choices and their tracking preferences easily and universally enforced across platforms. We shouldn't require consumers to do this many times for every service that they use. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Lee, you wanted to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, consumers clearly care about privacy, although I think, as Howard mentioned, the way you devise your survey is really important because words matter and definitions matter. So I think almost everybody in this room would answer a survey affirmatively if the question were, do you care about privacy? But I also think folks really like the internet the way it is. And I think the choices that consumers seem to be making are indicative of that fact. And I think it's a little bit of a fallacy to say that because consumers aren't choosing to opt out, that means they either don't understand it or are not exercising a privacy right. Perhaps they are.
Okay. I don't know. Howard, I didn't know if you wanted to give you a rebuttal, or since you were mentioned by name. So, but
I mean, I agree with what I think is the fundamental point here. We've framed this issue wrong, because if you say this issue is about control, I think this is a hopeless proposition. Any more than you can control the people that are in the transaction chain between you swiping your credit card at any retailer and it actually appearing on your statement. This is not a control problem. There is a consumer protection problem here if things are being done with the information that are harmful to consumers. But online advertising is not one of those things. This is a thing that by and large is beneficial to consumers, both in terms of the content it makes available to all of us and to markets because of the competitive effects of advertising.
Thanks, Howard. So Kind of related to that, I mean, a couple of the policy prescriptions we've heard today would, I think it was Ali who had suggested that maybe we should get away from behavioral targeting and go to contextual, back to a land of only contextual ads. But we've also seen, you know, from Howard's presentation and from some of the work that Garrett presented, is that behavioral targeted ads bring more revenue. So if we were, what would be the trade-off there? And, you know, what would world look like without behavioral targeting, where you have less revenue? Would that send more things behind a paywall? Will we have less rich content? Would there be exit? What would that, how would that shake out for consumers? So that's to anyone who wants to jump in and talk about that.
You know, I guess, I mean, we don't really know. It's an experiment that I think we're better off not running. But it is, what seems to me to be the most likely outcome is less content. Some stuff will retreat behind a paywall and survive, but even stuff behind a paywall often comes out and has spillover benefit in advertising markets. If you think about movies, okay, you got to pay to go to a movie. But the advertising revenue from when the broadcast television rights to that movie are sold is an important part of the economics of the movie business. If you can't have the advertising revenue or as much advertising revenue, it's likely to have adverse effects on content, and especially on content from small publishers.
Anja, you want to
You can, in addition to the points Howard made, you can imagine a world where there are just more ads on websites, right? So if each individual ad impression earns less money, and you want to keep the revenue inflow constant, you can just put more ads out there. Now, what the effect on consumers then is the question. Are consumers going to visit less often because they don't want to see lots of ads in front of them? Do they have, when they visit, perhaps a lower utility because they get less access to information? That's another question. What happens to the quality, right? So we might still be providing information, but if on average the inflow is going to be less, perhaps the quality, let's say the journalistic quality, is going down because there's less investment. So I think these are all possible outcomes. How precisely the world would look like is hard to predict.
Okay. Ali? Yeah.
So I was in the room yesterday, and I think my major takeaway yesterday was that the jury is out on the benefits, and maybe today we have different scientists in the room, so they feel differently, but the scientists we heard yesterday really had questions about the return on investment for targeted advertising. They also really had questions about how we measure who sees the targeted ad and whether advertisers are effectively measuring their impressions. So for example, I'm a huge Indigo Girls fan. I see targeted ads for Indigo Girls when they release a new album all the time. I've also already bought the album by the time I see those targeted ads. So that impression is wasted on me. I was going to buy the album whether I saw the ad or not, and in fact, bought the album before I saw the targeted ad. So I think until we have really good data on the return on investment, I don't think it's really appropriate to entertain sort of these doomsday scenarios. I think also, we lived in a world of contextual advertising for a very long time. Very, very long time. That's what we saw in magazines. That's what we saw in broadcast media. And I'm not saying magazines and broadcast media are the same thing as the internet. They're not. But marketers still figured out how to reach their audiences. In fact, my understanding is the percentage of GDP spent on advertising actually hasn't increased since the 1950s. It's just sort of shifted where it's being spent. So I think we need more data before we could jump to conclusions here.
Anja, and then Lee, I'll let...
I'll keep it quick.
Okay. Oh.
Okay, so...
I think Anja had a just really quick point.
Yeah, just two quick points, actually. I think so. I think what you're probably referring to the need to measure precisely advertising effectiveness, and I think that's definitely a very important point. And some advertisers, I've worked a lot with advertisers, and with some advertisers, I've seen how some are good and some are less good, and agencies in terms of measuring effectiveness. I would say that we've come a long way the last even 5 years, and there's a lot more knowledge in terms terms of measuring precisely advertising effectiveness, implementing some type of A/B testing, field experiments, and using that information to infer advertising effectiveness. So I completely agree that this data is important and should be the fundament of any such analysis and decision. I think we know a lot in advertising, know a lot now about advertisers, know a lot about how to measure and actually assign a particular value. And indeed, these are those values that then inform their bidding decisions. So I've done some research that Garrett previously referred to very briefly, where we look at potential or apparent algorithmic bias and look at economic actions between different economic actors, which indicate that ultimately in a particular field experiment, women are less likely to see employment ads for careers in the science, technology, engineering, math field, but not because of any evilness on the side of the advertiser, but simply because they have higher value to other advertisers because women do more shopping, right? And I think what this indicates indirectly is that advertisers do have a pretty good idea who's buying, roughly how much they would spend, how much they would earn from a particular impression, and that informs their bidding decisions, right? So I think there is actually, we are in a world now where there is a pretty high level of sophistication in terms of understanding advertising effectiveness. That was my very short point. My other very short point, and then I'll hand over to Lee. When we talk about who would actually suffer in terms of content providers, right? Who actually benefits, and I think Howard had this data, this graph before, who actually benefits? Well, if I'm the New York Times, right, I sell front page ads. I don't have any insights about New York Times sales mechanism, but front page ads, I could probably sell bulk to a buyer, right? I sell them all a certain share of front page advertising impressions because I know I get a lot of high quality consumers in there. If I'm a small website, small content provider, then I'm more likely to be in the behavioral advertising business. I'm selling particular consumers because I can't make the point that, you know, my content is so great because nobody actually knows my website very well. And so if we start thinking about moving away from behavioral advertising and retargeting, for example, we need to consider what are the effects for small sites and small firms relative to large firms, and it's possible that small firms might be more effective. It's your turn.
Yeah, thanks. Just a couple of points here. One, I think, you know, when it comes to ad effectiveness, I'm going to leave the discussion to the economists, but I do think that the perception in this case is reality, that targeted ads are perceived as being much more valuable in the economic industry that we live in, and so therefore, you know, it's relevant to talk about it. I also think in the conversation about contextual ads versus targeted ads, it's important to note for those that are really worried about the privacy piece of that contextual ads have data associated with them too. You know, we do things, you know, it's a little different than selling a magazine where you know that they've printed this number of magazines and you're paying per magazine. You have to have some data associated with the ad to show where it was and if somebody viewed it. And so I think, you know, if we're talking about contextual advertising as a solution for privacy, you know, we have other conversations to have. But I'd like to bring up the competition issue with respect to the concept of paywalls. Anya just mentioned the New York Times and how strong an advertising market it is. It's clearly also a strong market for those that would think about paywalls. A lot of consumers, first of all, there's the digital divide issue of who can pay and who can't pay to get access to content, and I think access to content is vital, especially in this day and age. We just finished an election, and access to content was certainly important to many of us who voted. But I also think consumers, to the extent that they're spending their limited dollars, would probably pay for the New York Times or for CNN or for Fox News or whatever, but they might no longer pay for the small single mom blog or the cooking site for, you know, down home Southern cooking. And so that really chills, you know, what makes the internet great. And also that if paywalls or microtransactions or whatever other alternative we're thinking about comes into play, it's much harder for those smaller publishers to implement that. It's very time and resource intensive. So I think there's a real competitive effect to that as well. Thanks.
Okay. Garrett and then Howard. Yeah, Garrett, go ahead.
So in my other life, my focus is measuring the effectiveness of advertising using large-scale experiments, and I can definitely tell you that there's a lot to be learned by industry there, but it shouldn't be completely far off. I mean, the point was raised, we need more data on does behavioral advertising create more value than contextual advertising alone. I would push back on that. Howard presented research looking at price differences. I've done my own version of that, accounting for as much as possible differences between opt-out users and the sort of websites that they're spending time on and the sort of browsing history that they can be associated with. And still, we're coming up with very similar numbers. In our case, minus 50%. In his case, minus 50% on one ad exchange, minus 72% on another. Avi Goldfarb also has a nice paper with Catherine Tucker comparing before and after in Europe. The European e-privacy directive, which temporarily clamped down on behavioral targeting, and there they saw that in terms of survey measures of ad effectiveness, this went down by 2/3. So I think we've seen time and time again that there's a somewhere between a twofold to fourfold increase in value created by online behavioral advertising. So certainly some privacy trade-offs that we need to think very hard about, but in terms of monetary value, I don't think that there's too much debate there.
Howard, did you want to?
Yeah, two quick points. One is we have a market test here of the value of this kind of advertising, and it's reflected in advertiser behavior every day. There is an academic literature that goes back at least 80 years, trying to think of the earliest paper I can remember, on the returns to advertising. In 80 years, it has come to no conclusion. If we wait for a conclusion about the academic value, assessment of the value of advertising, we won't have any advertising or any internet content. Second, I don't think any advertising has ever been purely contextually targeted. Media sellers and advertisers do a tremendous amount of research on the average characteristics of members of the audience in order to figure out where they want to reach the kind of people that they think will buy their product. I mean, you've all heard of soap operas, I'm sure. What many of you may not know is they were created by soap companies to attract a particular audience that they thought would be interested in their product. It's not, even when it looks contextual, there's a lot more behind it than that. What's different now is the information is person-specific rather than the average characteristics of the audience.
Thanks, Howard. I want to shift gears now and talk about Southern cooking websites now. That just got me thinking. That sounded good. But for at least the next 30 minutes, we'll talk about the consumer and protection and competition issues surrounding online advertising of Southern cooking websites. Anyway, I wanted to shift gears a little bit actually to behavioral targeting. I mean, it's about making predictions of who is going to likely to buy your product using consumer data to figure that out. Both Ali and Katie touched on this a little bit. More generally, is about we can think about using data to make all sorts of predictions. Predictions about who target who may be pregnant, who may not be pregnant. Predictions about, and they can lead us to give some people different prices. We heard a little, I think Ali talked a little bit about personalized pricing. We haven't seen much of this in the wild. We heard about, Amazon allegedly tried it 10, 15, maybe longer than that ago and got a lot of pushback on that. There was a little bit in the news about Expedia maybe listing higher-priced hotels, putting the higher-priced hotels higher for Mac users than PC users. That was a few years ago, but we haven't seen a lot of that. So I kind of had a two-part question here. One, why don't we seem to have the data to target ads and it happens, but we don't see a lot of we don't really seem to see personalized pricing. Though we hear a lot talked about that. So that's kind of question one is maybe why don't we see it? And then number two, just more generally from a policy standpoint, Should we will we think about accurate predictions where some may win and some may lose, but nonetheless they're accurate? Should we think about those as a privacy harm more generally? So let me throw that out. Allie, I don't know if you want to talk or well, I'll go Allie and then Katie. I know both of you have expressed some interest.
Sure. So I'm going to talk first about one area where we do see personalized pricing. And Wall Street Journal did an interesting study on personalized pricing. For any of you with computers, you can Google it. But one of the things they found was they were looking at staples and pricing of various products at staples. I think there are a few other examples in the article. But if you lived closer to a rival store, you would get a cheaper price. Understandably, right? They wanted you to buy online from them, not go down the street to the store. Turned out that the people who were getting lower prices also tended to be wealthier because those are the folks who have stores near them. So, sort of query as to who this differential pricing is benefiting and whether it's actually, entrenching some of the economic divide that we currently experience. I think as to, when predictions are accurate, is there harm? So, I think the question is accurate about what? So if you are advertising senior management positions in STEM fields, and you only advertise to men because, most people who are in STEM fields are men, or because, somebody bid higher in the instant ad, auction for, to show women something for nail polish. That was really condescending, I'm sorry. Or really flippant, I'm sorry. Maybe you get a great job candidate. Right? Like maybe that happens, but two people lose. First of all, you lose because you probably missed out on a really awesome, woman who might have transformed your business. And second of all, that woman who might have had a really awesome transformative experience in her own career missed out. So I think for me, the who loses is really what are you advertising? If you're advertising Indigo Girls album and I don't see the ad, I'm still going to buy the album. I don't lose out, right? Maybe Indigo Girls lose out, however, if I see the ad because they've spent the money on the ad to show it to me and I was going to buy it anyways. But when it gets to job postings or housing postings, you can see loss on both sides, losing qualified candidates and then also qualified candidates losing access to what could be really cool opportunities for them.
Thank you for the 90s reference, Indigo Girls. I did not know they were still around, or someone your age would even know they existed.
They put out a really awesome symphony album. You should check it out. That was your promotion for this panel.
All right. Katie, I'll let you jump in next.
So we don't really know about the full prevalence of first-degree price discrimination, also known as dynamic pricing, because it depends on outside researchers to uncover these practices, and so that's one reason why we don't know about them. But Consumer Reports has been, since 2000, has been looking into dynamic pricing schemes in the online travel and airline industry, and we found some instances of price discrimination, first-degree price discrimination for different users across a couple different websites. So it's definitely going on, at least in the airline industry, especially since the Air Transport Association, which is a global airline industry trade association, unveiled recently their new distribution capacity, which was to enhance product differentiation and to have a dynamic availability of fair products, that means prices, for consumers. And so this is based on your information as you travel the web, and so they're giving you a different price than your neighbor, which I don't think seems fair. And also, there's no transparency around how these fair prices are reached or what kind of information they're using in order to serve you with that price. We've also seen first-degree price discrimination in rideshare apps such as Uber and Lyft, which has used a lot of personal information on your phone, including your battery, in order to give you a different kind of fare increase than another individual might have. In addition, Uber in different countries has identified who might be regulators, who might regulate their activities, and has served them with a completely different app interface in order to skew how they felt and how they might regulate this industry. So first-degree price discrimination and first-degree discrimination on what kind of ads you're served with and what kind of app experiences you have are definitely happening. We just don't have a lot of transparency around it, which is one reason why we endorsed Senator Chuck Schumer's call for the Federal Trade Commission to investigate the airline industry and get some real answers about the use of dynamic pricing, because we can't just depend on consumer groups like Consumer Reports to unveil these practices. We have to ask for more policies from our regulators to protect us in the first instance.
Let's see, Anja, I know you wanted to jump in and.
Yeah, just quickly, because you ask, is it that the accuracy of prediction can lead to privacy harm? I think that's a very interesting question. I think the one point I would say as a marketer, fairness is a very fickle concept. You know, it's very hard to define what consumers regard and disregard as fair. You know, I can also say, is the accuracy of the prediction that somebody is or maybe self-identifies as a student or a senior citizen a privacy harm because everybody else in the population will pay a higher fare for buses or entries to the zoo? So I think to some extent, you know, the predictions are being made by somebody else when people self-identify, but is it really such a different type of question?
Anja, Howard, I know you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I want to make 2 points, I guess. One is, in a lot of contexts, price discrimination is a good thing, not a bad thing, when it happens in markets. And the airline industry is actually a good example because it probably couldn't survive if it could only charge one price to everybody. They need to fill the plane. That's an important constraint on costs and the availability of air transportation to people who can't afford as much, who can't pay first class. And it happens because they give lower prices to people who value the transportation less, that are willing to stay over a weekend. As an example that's been with us in the airline industry for decades. And why using information gathered online changes that fundamental economics or the fundamental benefits of that practice escapes me. Second, about accurate predictions, I don't think. I mean, there's accurate predictions are generally a good thing, and predictions based on more information are generally a good thing. If you don't have information, you fall back on stereotypes. Those suppress information, and they use misinformation in a lot of cases. When I was at the FTC in the late 70s, we brought a lot of equal credit opportunity enforcement actions, and every time we looked at a judgmental creditor, which is somebody who looks at you and assesses your worth and willingness to repay and says, okay, I'll give you a loan, and no, I won't give one to you, there was discrimination, every one of them. If you looked at the people who used models and risk predictions and credit scoring, there wasn't. Right? More information reduces discriminatory problems in general, not in every instance, but in general, rather than making people rely on the stereotypes they carry around with them and don't even know they have.
Sure. So I think, you know, that may generally be true, but sort of an important caveat to what Howard just says is it really depends on what the data set is made from. So there was recently, Amazon revealed that they had to stop their and I realize I'm getting outside of online advertising here for a second, but bear with me. Amazon had to stop their algorithmic resume screen because the data was built on the training data set was built on who has worked at Amazon. And the algorithm was systematically pulling out lacrosse players and people with male names and systematically dropping out of consideration people who'd went to all women's colleges and other folks who had, you know, sort of clear indicators that they were female, because Amazon, like many tech companies, has a predominantly male workforce. And so, yes, it is certainly true that data can be used to undermine, to eat away at insidious biases. It can also be used to entrench those biases and to hide those biases and sort of make them look natural because, you know, the machine is not biased, right? The machine just came up with it. We don't know how it ended up with all of these male lacrosse players as like the people we should hire next. So it can cut both ways. That's what I want to say.
There are discrimination problems out there in the world. There's no doubt about that, but they are discrimination problems. They are not privacy problems.
So I just wanted to make the point that having accuracy in the kind of behavioral ad delivery Whether or not there's a privacy issue, and that is not necessarily the framing that I would suggest. I would say that the privacy issue occurred in the outset, where you collected my data without my permission, online and offline, to create a kind of personalized dossier about me with conclusions that may or may not be correct in order to serve me with behavioral ads and also different prices. And so that is, I think, the privacy infringement occurred right at the beginning. Also, when you didn't follow my do not track signals, which many companies do not follow, even though most browsers allow you to signal that. In addition, I just wanted to point out that some consumers might feel like they're benefiting from targeted ads, but a lot of consumers do not. And in fact, many consumers feel freaked out or concerned about the kind of advertisements they've been served with. The kind of conversations around whether or not Facebook or Instagram is listening to you is the kind of example here where consumers have no idea how they're getting such targeted advertisements based on things that they only said out loud. And so that kind of disconnect between consumer knowledge and the kind of tracking that's happening is a huge problem that should be addressed before we talk about the efficiency or the worth of these advertisements.
Let me, I'll get, Allie, maybe you can answer this or react, but while we're on while we're on the subject of price discrimination or personalization and predictions, we have a question from the audience I think is a good one, sort of clarifying perhaps. You mentioned dynamic pricing, but is dynamic pricing really price discrimination? Because dynamic pricing is really just adjusting the price to supply and demand conditions. So should we think about that as price discrimination, or just kind of changing the market equilibrium based on shifts in supply and demand?
But I don't really think it is about supply and demand, right? It's about my possible willingness to pay. And by having these kinds of tailored prices and tailored advertisements to me, you're also diminishing my share of the consumer surplus, which is a harm.
So I want to address two definitional things. I think there's sort of dynamic pricing, sort of lowercase d, which is, hey, most of the tickets on this train are sold out, therefore, for everyone, all of the tickets are more expensive. And then there's the kind of dynamic pricing Katie is talking about, which is, hey, they've realized that I live in a wealthier area and that I have, I'm a lawyer and whatever, and they realize I really desperately want to go to New York this weekend, and so they're charging me a higher price. There are two different things there, and at least to me, one of them raises more concern than the other. I also want to really quickly address Howard's point of that's not a privacy concern, that's a discrimination concern. I think there's a definitional thing there, too. So there are certainly folks who are concerned about privacy as I want to be left alone. I am the king of my castle. Leave me alone. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's really important. Privacy does extend from sort of the Brandeisian property rights idea. But there's also privacy is a way that we make sure to protect, or I should say lack of privacy undermines some of the other values that are really important to us. And that includes things like civil rights, access to opportunities, having fair access to information online. Sort of what does lack of privacy lead to? Informational disparities, discriminatory access to opportunities. And so when I talk about privacy harms, I do think about some of the discrimination and more civil rightsy harms, because I think that, as Katie sort of more artfully explained than I did, these are sort of when you take the privacy violations and the personalization as far as they can go, or maybe not as far as they can go, but sort of to their conclusions, that's where you end up.
Oh, all right, thanks. So in both, I think both in Katie and Allie, in your presentations, you had talked about, said that self-regulation doesn't appear to be working in this market. So I wanted to put that on the table that has self-regulation failed to protect consumer privacy here, and if that's the case, what's the alternative? So I'll ask let Garrett kind of take the first cut at this, and then Lee may have something to say. I'm not sure.
Great. Well, I'll start by saying that I think an opt-out option is highly desirable in that we have the kind of two facts here. Online behavioral advertising generates a tremendous amount of revenue for publishers, and also we have people that are very concerned about their privacy. So an opt-out allows these things to coexist. I other policy options have to go down the ways of hard trade-offs, of ignoring one or the other considerations. So I think the Ad Choices program has some advantages. Because it was rolled out by industry, it was done relatively rapidly, it had good coverage, it's kept up with a very fast-moving technology frontier, but there's certainly lots of complaints about it. You would hope that the industry would apply some of the same determination it does to putting identifiers on consumers' computers as it does to making sure that the opt-out choice remains preserved and isn't just deleted by a cookie. They have done some work on this by creating a browser extension that preserves these preferences, but that's not very easy to find on the website. You would also expect that if consumers care so much about online behavioral advertising, you would also expect that they would have strong preferences against things like database matches, and so this would be something that the industry might want to consider extending there as well. Now, the other question was about alternatives. So this is a really tricky thing, right? Because one alternative is to go down the way of a browser do not track route. And that would have the advantage of preserving people's privacy preferences, but it does have the challenge that browsers could set the defaults in ways that don't fully internalize the externality that would have on the advertising industry and on the web. The GDPR, which we'll be talking about later, is kind of an interesting case because the language of the GDPR says that you need explicit opt-in where consumers need to present to every single company and every single use of their data. That's sort of the de jure expectation, but the de facto thing we've seen so far is an opt-out. And as Anya says, the experience of being a European consumer on the web is not super fun. You get to see all sorts of consent pages every time you visit a web page. And about 90% of these people are sort of going on without opting out, according to data released from Quantcast. A couple of people have brought up this new bill presented by Senator Ron Wyden, where he essentially is arguing for a federal do not track page, somewhat like the do not call list. As I read the legislation, it's wanted to make the federal government a clearinghouse for some of these consent mechanisms. There may be some arguments that suggested that the federal do not call list did a much better job of protecting consumers than the industry version. But I think if you're the FTC, you should think very, very long and hard about whether you want to be doing this job, given just how technologically sophisticated these things are. So I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, when I think about the concept or the question which I'm asked a lot, which is self-regulation failing? Has it failed to protect, especially now that we're talking about a new privacy legislation or regulation? My answer is always, as compared to what? What is the alternative? The industry came together, and as early as 2000, and tried to address the issues that were concerns at the time. It's kind of similar to, one of my members gave me this example, so I'll give them credit, but I'm going to use it. Seatbelts are not failing because we still have car accident deaths. Seatbelts are saving lives. A code of conduct that has strong privacy protections is helping. If there is more that we should be doing, we're happy to engage in conversations to do it. But I think you can't measure, the way the industry may have developed without a code of conduct that has strong privacy regulation or self-regulation within it. So many of our members have declined business model opportunities, declined to do certain things, declined partnerships with companies because those things would not comply with our code. So I do think we have prevented harm from happening in the marketplace. And so I think the opt-out, as Garrett mentioned, the opt-out regime certainly is something that we strongly advocate for, but I will note that our code does contain a requirement for opt-in consent when the information that we're using is sensitive enough. So for example, precise location data or sensitive health data. Those things cannot be used without a user's explicit opt-in consent. And so if there are more of those things that we should be considering, then that is something that we are always talking about and always trying to do. But I resist strongly the argument that self-regulation has failed.
Thanks. With all respect to Lee and the NIA, the privacy principles they came out with in the early 2000s, which, by the way, was in response to avoiding legislation around this issue, were not strong even back then. And then we've seen a complete abandonment of these principles over the course of a few years, right? Like, these principles were only supposed to be followed by coalition members. Then the NIA allowed for other associate coalition members to join, but they don't have to follow the rules. They just have to pay dues. And a few years after
That's completely 100% untrue, by the way. You must be mixing up trade associations or self-regulatory organizations.
Okay. But only a few companies are following the regulations even just a few years after they were introduced. And the fact that consumers don't know a lot about these tools, I think, would be another example of the failure of self-regulation. And the call for data policy here at the federal level, and the number of committee meetings we've been having around it, is another sign that consumers are not satisfied with the self-regulatory tools that have been provided to them.
Well, so to pile on, so first let me just say that, self-regulation is an important tool as far as it goes, and public knowledge has been willing to and interested in working with folks in the industry to come up with the best self-regulatory tools they can. They only go so far. And there are a few reasons for this. First of all, I talked about ad choices, right? So that was their self-regulatory tool, was this tool that we know what would be useful to consumers, so let's do this other thing. Or I should say, we know what would be more useful to consumers, let's do this other thing. I think the other piece is, even taking Lee, at her word, and she's been quite lovely to sit next to, that NI, is not the one Katie's talking about. Even if all of her companies are really, really good actors and they're turning down business opportunities with really bad actors, there are still the really bad actors out there who aren't going to voluntarily play in a self-regulatory regime because they feel that they can get ahead if they don't. Now, you may be saying, but Ellie, those, bad actors aren't going to follow the law anyways. But if there was a law and, it gave enforcement authority to an agency, or gave folks or to state AGs, or gave folks a private right of action, there might actually be redress for the folks who don't follow the law. So I do think that there is an important role for legislation here, and I think we're seeing that in the conversations that are happening in Congress now. And I do want to say that, I don't see that legislation as pertains to the advertising industry, right? I see that as comprehensive privacy legislation that applies to all of the actors in this space. Some of them are advertisers, some of them are ISPs, some of them are completely other entities. So it's not let's gang up on the ad industry. It's there's a lot of data out there. There are a lot of risks associated with that data. Let's have some rules of the road. Let's create expectations for businesses, and let's create some protections for consumers. And I think there's an appetite for that. And I think it will also benefit groups like Lee's that want to be doing the right thing because they won't have that competitor over there doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, and just if I could just add to that, I think, absolutely, I think federal legislation and comprehensive privacy legislation is something we are absolutely thrilled to talk about. We've been trying to advocate, for the right privacy protective practices for 20 years. And so I do think, however, that self-regulation has a strong role to play in that. And I think, the FTC is already resource constrained, and we can certainly help keep those good actors in line. And I agree with you about the bad actors. I tend to not like them either. So, definitely, but I do think that privacy legislation has to balance all of the stuff that we've been talking about today. So it has to balance privacy concerns with the innovative, open, and free internet that we have today, and it has to find that right balance. And so, we are happy to engage in those discussions and looking forward to it.
I think we have about a minute left by that clock, but we're right up at 2:30 by that clock because I think we started a little late. So rather than getting into my next question, which is what would privacy legislation look like, and solving that in a minute and 15 seconds, well, I think we actually did. I think Lee and Allie agreed on what that's going to look like, and they're working on it right now up on Capitol Hill. So anyway, please join me in thanking our panelists for such a vibrant discussion today.